Les agradeceré acepten la invitación y bueno, vamos empezando. De nuevo, muchísimas gracias por estar aquí el día de hoy. Es la primera sesión que tenemos de nuestro seminario de investigación dentro del programa para el estudio de la violencia, el PEV, que este es como nuestro tercer ciclo de seminario. Nos da muchísimo gusto que tras extender nuestras invitaciones, muy amablemente Jessie fue de las primeras en aceptar. Estamos, ahora se las presento, pero como habrán visto tenemos un grupo muy nutrido y es un gusto de verdad empezar el día de hoy con esta investigación en particular. Jessie ahora está terminando, ya está en las últimas etapas de su investigación doctoral, pero ya con una posición en la Universidad de Syracuse como profesora, y la felicitamos, y tiene otras ofertas en puerta que igualmente nos dan muchísimo gusto. Ella ahora está en la Universidad de Harvard. Su investigación, sus áreas de investigación se concentran en política comparada y economía política, con, como habrán visto, una particular atención en temas de conflicto, crimen organizado, desigualdad, política redistributiva y Estado de Derecho. Y su tesis doctoral, que es justamente lo que nos presenta el día de hoy, Machine Gun Politics, Why Politicians Cooperate with Criminal Groups, es una teoría innovadora sobre cómo los políticos hacen alianzas con los actores criminales, como habrán visto, con un trabajo muy extenso de trabajo de campo en Brasil, en Río de Janeiro. Y de hecho este trabajo ya ganó premios como parte de la Asociación Latinoamericana de Estudios Latinoamericanos, LASA. Reiteramos nuestra felicitación también a Jessie por ello, además de que está trabajando en muchas más dimensiones sobre violencia, desigualdad y seguridad pública, igualmente con un enfoque en Brasil, pero sabemos que también tiene interés en explorar el caso mexicano, entonces ojalá que esta sea una oportunidad para compartir con Jessie más opciones y ideas de cómo llevar a cabo ese trabajo. Y quien le va a comentar es nuestra colega Amalia Pulido, quien es profesora de la División de Estudios Políticos, igualmente enfocada en temas justamente de cómo se entrelazan las elecciones, los partidos y el crimen organizado. Y estamos seguros de que seguramente más de ustedes, dados sus trabajos, nos podrán compartir también su retroalimentación. Nuestro seminario, en lo general, funciona con 30 minutos más o menos de presentación por parte de la ponente, seguido por unos 10 minutos de comentarios por parte de la comentarista, luego un poco de intercambio entre ellas, y abriremos a preguntas y respuestas del resto del público. Me pueden ir mandando a mí sus preguntas conforme, y los puedo ir anotando, simplemente sus nombres para que abramos el micrófono para ustedes. Y bueno, como usualmente lo hacemos una combinación de inglés, español, pueden sentirse en libertad de hacer las preguntas como se sientan más cómodos igualmente. Y sin más, de nuevo, muchas gracias, Jessie, por estar aquí. Welcome and thank you so much, and congratulations again on the multiple achievements. Please go ahead. Thank you.
Wow, well, Sandra, thank you so much for the very generous introduction. I'm so excited to be here with all of you today. And thank you to everyone at CIDE for making this happen. So here, I'll go ahead and share my screen. The talk that I'm going to give, as Sandra mentioned, Machine Gun Politics, Why Politicians Cooperate with Criminal Groups, is one specific paper that I'm presenting, but is a broader book-length dissertation manuscript that I'm working towards, that I'm really eager to get feedback from all of you on, specifically how it translates to Mexico. So the specific theory that I'll present today was born in Rio de Janeiro, but I'm very excited to open up the dialogue to a cross-country analysis moving forward. So first, I want to start with the question, why do politicians and criminal groups strike deals? And dominant theories really suggest that politicians have little agency when they're bargaining with criminal groups, and that if they strike a deal, it's generally because the criminal group is driving the transaction. We can kind of think of these as falling in one of two categories. The first is really where politicians are characterized as victims, or they're striking the deal out of fear, usually in order to mitigate violence from the part of the criminal group. And the second is where politicians are bribe takers, and they're striking a deal out of greed, hoping to enrich themselves or to collect further benefits from office. Now, this is most iconically conceptualized in Pablo Escobar's Plata o Plomo threat from Colombia, literally silver or lead. I know I don't need to translate that for this audience, but referring to the very stark choice for a politician to be the victim of violence or to kind of become his figurehead, more or less. But even in cases where politicians aren't faced with such a stark decision, the dominant literature is clear that when criminal groups and politicians strike deals, generally, the criminal groups are the ones that are leading the transaction. But these only represent a fraction of the wide range of politician-criminal group arrangements. My theory gives politicians a bit more agency than what we've seen so far. And I argue that politicians proactively might even strike these deals and take initiative themselves to contract criminal groups in order to win elections. They do this by hiring criminals as brokers in order to obtain votes. This is a part of a broader theory that I am developing about criminal clientelism that can be a winning electoral strategy for these vote-seeking politicians. Now, rather than focusing on the way that Pablo Escobar bullied politicians to do his bidding, this was really born in Rio de Janeiro, which is a context where drug traffickers write their juicy memoirs from behind bars, telling stories about politicians coming in their communities to host barbecues or dance parties. Or it's a case where in some of my interviews with residents of these communities, voters told me stories about criminal groups handing out these little papers in this bottom image that you see here on their way to the polling station with a veiled implicit threat as they were heading towards the polling station. This paper focuses on two specific research questions that really get at this underlying question of how criminal brokers deliver votes to their political partners. The first is, why might criminal groups be effective brokers? And the second, how do criminal groups get votes? I make two main theoretical contributions. The first is to argue that striking deals with criminal groups can be a winning strategy for politicians. And the second is to show that criminal groups can affect outcomes through two core mechanisms that I define. The first I call corralling, which is related to shaping voter choice. And the second, gatekeeping, which is related to restricting the candidate pool. I study this in local elections in criminally controlled areas in Rio de Janeiro. I leverage two different empirical strategies and collect a wide range of evidence in order to make this argument, drawing from 18 months of fieldwork, an original database I constructed on criminal groups, granular administrative data, and anonymous complaints that help to flesh out my own qualitative work from voters about candidates or criminal groups during elections. As a preview of the results that I'll get into much more detail later, I find that voters that live under criminal control turn out at higher rates, vote in more concentration, and that fewer candidates are allowed to campaign. And one more thing that I'll say here about these results is that I really focus on explaining electoral outcomes, unlike some of the other existing explanations that focus on explaining variables related to the fear or to the greed hypotheses. So these focus specifically not just on any one candidate that voters prefer, but the way that voters behave on their way to the polling station. There are two main questions. The first, why might criminal groups be effective brokers? I argue that the criminal organizations derive their power from control over territory and the fact that they're not specifically affiliated with any one party. I go into much more detail in this in the paper itself, but I'm going to skip over this section in this short talk and happy to talk about any questions in the Q&A. The second core theoretical component is, how do criminal groups get votes? Once they've used their power either over voters or over candidates, how do they obtain and deliver votes to their preferred candidates? And here's where the corralling and gatekeeping mechanisms come back in. First, the corralling mechanism is going to be voter-centric. So I argue that criminal organizations leverage their power over voters to shape voter choice through two different tactics. First is coercion. This could be beating somebody up as a threat to get them to vote for their specific candidate. Or it could merely be passing by somebody's house and saying, I'll see you at the polling station tomorrow. If I don't, I'll come back later. Could also be persuasion. This could be garden variety vote buying, or more elaborate types of gifts of paying for somebody's cataract surgery, creating a neighborhood football pitch or a neighborhood health center, the types of things that voters may view as a positive and may truly persuade them to vote for a criminal group's preferred candidate. Criminal groups can use coercion and persuasion together, and they indeed often do. The second mechanism is gatekeeping, which rather than focusing on voters, focuses on candidates. And I argue that criminal organizations leverage their ability to control territory, focusing on the way that they reinforce the perimeter of territories they control in order to shape the candidate pool and selectively allow some candidates access to their voters and obstruct access to those that haven't struck a deal with them. In doing so, they effectively prune the information that voters have about certain candidates and make it relatively easy or more difficult for voters to learn about and get information about the available candidate pool. There are three different outcomes that I observe in looking at the presence of corralling or gatekeeping in communities. The first is that I predict that corralling will lead to higher turnout in criminally controlled areas. This is because if criminal organizations are effective at either coercing or persuading voters to go to the polling station for their preferred candidate, we can think of turnout as a relatively inexpensive way for them to observe if voters are complying with their demands. Turnout is easier to monitor than the button that somebody actually presses behind closed doors in a polling station, let's say. And because these groups have access to violence, you might imagine that the calculus for a voter to actually show up, even if they don't eventually comply with the criminal organization's demands, is a relatively simple choice to make. The second prediction related to the gatekeeping hypothesis is that fewer candidates will get votes. This is due to the information mechanism and the information channel that I mentioned, that if we observe criminal organizations effectively pruning off rival candidates one by one and obstructing access to the community, then voters will learn less about a broader range of candidates, and we might expect fewer candidates to get votes. The third and most important outcome that I observe, and you can kind of think of this as the summary outcome related to both mechanisms, is vote concentration. Now, if criminal organizations are effective not just at pushing voters to the polling station and getting higher turnout, but also at the end of the day, influencing who they vote for, then we might observe higher vote concentration for the winningest or select few most winning candidates in the ballot box, influencing not just their journey to the polling station, but the actual candidate that they end up voting for behind closed doors. And similarly, we might expect criminal organizations through gatekeeping to impact vote concentration by not only exposing the voters that they control to fewer candidates, but then also shifting the proportion of the people they're voting for their most preferred or couple of most preferred candidates as well. I expect all of these to increase the returns to criminal clientelism for the prospective vote buying politician and make this potentially risky act seem worth the while for any politician looking to win. So summarizing these hypotheses, I argue that in areas where criminal groups govern, voters will turn out at a higher rate, vote returns will be concentrated on a single or small number of candidates, and fewer candidates will receive at least one vote. And these are going to be indicative of the corralling and gatekeeping hypotheses, respectively. As a brief note about the context, I look at this in the 2008, 12, 16, and 20 Rio de Janeiro City Council elections. Now, I focus on legislative elections because the bar is relatively low for candidates to be able to win and get access into these communities. And these candidates are also low profile enough that potential affiliation with a criminal organization wouldn't be quite as disastrous as someone that's running for a much higher profile race. The party system and electoral rules in Brazil are such that it creates these bizarre circumstances where for every one of these races, we have more than 1,500 candidates vying for just 51 seats in city council. Can again go into a little more detail in this in the Q&A, but the most important point for you all to remember is what this tells us is that these races are incredibly competitive and margins are razor thin. It truly is one of those types of electoral races where every vote matters. Now, one of the places where candidates often go in order to find cheap votes are Rio de Janeiro's favelas. Here we see there's one in the foreground. There's at least 3 in the background of this photo. Favelas, informal settlements, are generally where the urban poor live in Rio de Janeiro. Not only are they places where candidates go to get cheap votes, but they're also places where criminal groups usually dominate. And across the entire city, criminal groups govern hundreds of these informal settlements in Rio de Janeiro. I constructed a database measuring the presence of criminal organizations across Rio de Janeiro's more than 1,000 favelas. It draws from this website, Crimes News RJ. Despite the title, it is written in Portuguese. And I used some text processing techniques in order to extract the name of the gang. Here in this circled area, you see CV, and then the name of the community before, in order to construct identifiers that match the faction name with the geographic entity. The final result as a map looks like this. I was able to identify a faction for about 64% of favelas that cover 85% of favela residents. What this tells us is that all large and medium-sized and even small but important ones next to consumer neighborhoods or next to important points of transit are included in this database. And those that aren't are going to look more like informal roadside shanty towns with about 200 to 300 people, very, very small, unimportant in the criminal government sense communities. The outcomes that I'm looking at, recall that this is predictions about voting behavior, are going to be drawing from electoral data, where our relevant unit of analysis is the ballot box. For each of these 3 hypotheses, I operationalize 3 different outcomes. To measure corralling, I calculate turnout. To measure vote concentration, I use the popular Herfindahl-Hirschman index. commonly used in economics to estimate monopoly concentration, also used in political science to estimate vote concentration or competition. And then for the final gatekeeping hypothesis, I calculate the number of candidates per ballot box that receive votes. There are two different empirical strategies that I use in order to estimate the effect of criminal control on voting behavior. The first is an as-if random ballot box assignment, which allows us to look at broad estimates across the entire municipality and over time. And the second is a difference in differences design, which zooms in on a smaller subset of favelas, but gives us more precise causal estimates, allowing me to identify the effect of criminal governance and disentangle this from other favela level factors. So I'll explain them both in turn. Starting with the first one, the as-if random ballot box assignment. I compare how favela residents vote that live under criminal governance with how their neighbors vote that do not live in criminally controlled neighborhoods. This sample is 865 favelas across all of Rio de Janeiro. These are favelas that I identified from the criminal governance database as being controlled by criminal organizations over all 4 election years. And the identification looks something like this. A key fact to keep in mind here is that the place where anyone votes in Brazil, one's residential address is predictive but not deterministic for the place where somebody votes. So the clearest way that I usually describe this is that as youth come of age and turn 18 and are allowed to vote for the first time, they're often assigned to vote in a different ballot box than their parents are, even though they live under the same roof. It may be one of many that are nearby, but it's often not the closest, often not the same location as where their parents live. The electoral courts that assign voters to a ballot box prioritize balance in the number of people that are assigned to ballot box over the specific geographic location. So you might think that anyone would be assigned to a ballot box in a certain radius of their residential address, but which specific one is going to be as if random. So for concreteness, you could imagine a polling station, let's say a primary school, that's close to a criminally governed favela that has 3 ballot boxes. In this classroom 1, box 1, we'll see that about 75% of the voters in box 1 live under criminal control and 25% live in the non-criminally governed nearby area. On the contrary, in box 3, it's going to be nearly the opposite. About only a quarter of voters live under criminal control and 3/4 live in the non-criminally governed nearby areas. And by obtaining these percentages via an information request, I was able to calculate the precise share of voters that live under criminal control for every ballot box in the sample, which yields us broad estimates both across geography over all criminally governed favelas and time, all 4 election years. Here's the estimating equation that I use in order to study this. And to present the results, first looking at the turnout hypothesis, I observe about a 6.3 decrease in the proportion of non-voters. And forgive the double negative here, but turnout is already mandatory. Voting is mandatory in Brazil. So it's quite a high threshold of voting turnout and voter participation to begin with. So even though this is a pretty small decrease in the proportion of non-voters, because the threshold is already quite high, this is indeed significant, even though it's a modest effect. Looking at the second hypothesis, I observe larger effects for vote concentration when comparing voters that live under criminal governance with those that do not. It would be the equivalent of the leading candidate in a criminally controlled neighborhood capturing about 5% more of the vote share. which tells us that criminal governance is positively correlated with vote concentration. And then finally, in looking at the number of candidates that get votes, I find that about 2.5 fewer candidates will be receiving votes as the number of criminally controlled voters increases at each respective ballot box, which tells us that criminal governance is negatively correlated with the number of candidates receiving votes. I calculate a wide range of robustness checks and alternative dependent variables, which again, I can go into more detail in the Q&A. Now, at this point, you may be thinking, okay, these are correlations, but there may be a wide range of other factors related to life in a favela that may be driving these results, not just criminal governance. And I had this thought too. After all, the comparison group using the first strategy were residents that do not live in favelas, that live in slightly higher income, more formalized, more incorporated to the city style neighborhoods. In this second empirical strategy, I look just at favelas, just at the same set of favelas holding the underlying voters constant, while criminal governance is the only variable that changes over time. For this, I just look at a sample of 12 favelas, again, those that I identify through using the criminal governance database that I constructed, and find 6 that underwent a turf war over 2 election years, and match these with 6 similar favelas that did not undergo a turf war and had constant criminal governance during the time period. Stylistically, this looks something like this, where all 12 favelas were controlled by criminal organizations in the first time period. And then in the second time period, those that had underwent the turf war condition were kind of in a, you might call it like a power vacuum during the time of the second election year. The turf war, I wrote the condition as such so that the turf war occurred right before the election year. So it was more of a state of chaos and not a fully new, organized, established regime. This allows us to isolate the effect of criminal governance from other favela level factors related to demographics or socioeconomic status. It's a simple 2-period difference in differences design. I also control for the share criminal control variable that I showed that was key to the first identification strategy. Here's just some plots of parallel trends that are extended to the 2 periods prior to, just to check that the ballot box level returns are consistent with what we may imagine. And then presenting all 3 variables here, I find that there was no change in turnout as one group went from controlled by criminal organizations to the turf war condition. But I find stronger supporting evidence for both the vote concentration and the number of candidates hypothesis. First, I find that the vote was about 5 to 25% more concentrated for the leading candidate in the community that was consistently governed by criminal groups for both time periods. And I also find that for that same group, about 7.3 fewer candidates got votes than compared to the group that transitioned to the turf war condition. So summarizing both identification strategies, I find using the broad variation in ballot box design that about 6.3% decrease in the proportion of non-voters. I find no evidence of a change in turnout using the difference in differences design. I find supporting evidence for the vote concentration hypothesis for both strategies. And I also find supporting evidence for the number of candidates gatekeeping hypothesis for both strategies. So my qualitative evidence also suggests strong evidence of both corralling and gatekeeping. I find that in my interviews with candidates in Rio, that I was told time and time again, you can count on having the votes that you buy from criminal groups. And they reference both persuasive and coercive tactics that were used. Drawing from the anonymous complaints from voters, voters complained about criminal groups splitting up at different polling stations and staying there all day on the street to ensure that people go to vote for their candidate. And they also refer to persuasive and coercive tactics to get them to come to the polls. And thinking about gatekeeping, candidates in interviews often complain to me about how exclusive or nearly exclusive access is a part of the terms of the trade. And they use the specific Portuguese turn of phrase, fechar com, which means to strike a deal with, but implies this unilateral sense of deal striking, meaning you can't fechar com with everybody. Candidates were also on the receiving end of gatekeeping, and they complained about being prohibited from campaigning in some favelas because the criminals had already struck a deal with one of their rivals. Drawing from the voter complaints, voters said, they're not letting any other candidate that's not candidate name work here. He made a deal with the local traffickers. Other candidates that want to work here have to pay 15 to 20,000 reais. People that want to work in the neighborhood for another candidate can't if they don't pay the traffickers. So to summarize, in this paper, I argue that politicians hire criminal group members to deliver votes through two mechanisms that I call corralling and gatekeeping. And I empirically show how criminal governance can affect voting, that living under criminal governance can lead to higher turnout, higher vote concentration, and fewer candidates receiving votes. There are three theoretical contributions of this paper. I introduce an underexplored class of broker, explain how capacities derived from criminal governance, corralling, and gatekeeping can be used to get votes, and in doing so, bring the literatures on criminal governance and clientelism closer together. That is all I have. I welcome your questions, and I'm really looking forward to getting into any of the future implications or to seeing how this argument travels to the Mexican case. Thank you all so much for your attention.
Thank you, Jessie, for such a great presentation and very, very clear description of all the things that you've been doing. It's amazing the different levels of research that you did, and I know that all our grad students will be very grateful to learn from this experience. And I know there will be many questions that you'll be receiving, but let me open to Amalia's comments. And thank you so much, Amalia, for accepting the invitation to comment Jessie's work.
Thank you, Sandra. It's really nice to be in this seminar once again. And thank you, Jessie. I really enjoyed reading your paper. I think it's amazing what you are doing here, the quantitative and the qualitative research that you did in this paper and in your dissertation. It's really amazing. I think, so your paper introduced the concept of criminal clientelism, that it's you describe this concept as a competitive electoral strategy. And it's really interesting to see this perspective or this assumption that political parties and candidates are not passive actors anymore, right? One of the assumptions that you make in this paper is that actually candidates and parties have agency in this concept of criminal clientelism. Basically, criminal clientelism is the interaction between politicians and criminal groups that involves trading votes to influence elections. So basically, candidates are looking help from criminal groups to get more votes or to maximize their winning chances in favelas. So I think this is a really important assumption in the criminal governance and in the way we are understanding how these interactions happen between politicians and criminal organizations. We tend to think about this interaction as well. Parties or candidates do not have a choice. They have to accept what the criminal groups want, and that means that basically they have to work for the criminal groups. And I think this new perspective and this theoretical concept is really interesting. So one important assumption that that you make in the paper is that negotiation with criminal groups is the most efficient way to win, and candidates carefully consider the cost and benefits of working with criminal brokers. So criminal groups are seen here as brokers between politicians and citizens, and basically politicians want to negotiate with criminal groups to reduce uncertainty in the electoral outcomes. So I think the two mechanisms that you present are really puzzling and really interesting. The first one, corralling, you mentioned criminal groups shape voter choice through coercion and persuasion. And as you mentioned, your two hypotheses, one is related to higher turnout and the other one is a higher vote concentration. And the other mechanism is gatekeeping, as you already mentioned. Criminal groups shape candidate pool and restrict access to voters to information and access to candidates to certain regions. So basically, candidates can't campaign in certain regions of the favelas. So I would like to make some general comments about your argument. And then I want to comment on each of the mechanisms that you present today. So when I was reading the first pages of your paper, I was thinking, why do politicians enter the race in regions controlled by criminal groups? So what are the incentives that politicians have to do this in the first place? And I was thinking about, well, who are the candidates that are entering in these races? What can we learn about the candidates' profiles? Do you know or do you expect that candidates have criminal connections before their decision to enter the race? I think this will be really interesting to explore, maybe in this paper or maybe in future research. I think in this paper you have like 10 different papers with things. So I think this is really cool because you have different questions to answer. And I was thinking about this. I would like to see who are these kind of candidates. Who are the candidates who are getting higher vote concentration, or who are the candidates who actually are winning in these ballots, right? Do they have a prior criminal connection? And where is the political context in these favelas? Maybe there are already candidates who, or not candidates, but politicians and elected politicians who are working with criminal groups. So I think this is a really important thing to consider when you're making this argument. Who are the candidates, if they have criminal connections or if they are working with a specific criminal group? Also, I would like to see a broader discussion on the political cost for candidates. What are the implications of candidates to reaching criminal groups out? I mean, they have votes, and one in the first section of your paper, you tell us this story about Lucas, I think was the name of the guy, giving money to criminal groups to get votes. But what are the costs for politicians to do this, or for candidates to do this? Once they win, do they have to operate, or do they have to benefit criminal groups in the political decisions they made every day? So I think this is also an important thing to consider when you are thinking about all this theoretical argument. Also, now I will start talking about the mechanisms that you are mentioned. In the first one, in corralling, I think violence, violence is completely absent in the analysis, right? You mentioned that criminal groups have these two strategies. One is coercion and the other is persuasion, but I didn't see any control variable to capture violence. I was thinking that, I don't know, maybe before the election day, there are higher violence in any or in certain regions to send a signal to citizens that they have to behave in certain ways. So I was thinking, and I mean, you mentioned that basically they give information or they bias the information about candidates in the corralling mechanisms. But I was thinking, what about violence? Do criminal groups use violence to achieve corralling, maybe before the election, as I already mentioned, and maybe violence increase in certain regions to send this signal. So I think this is something that you can control, and that maybe you can capture in some of your models to see how violence play a role in this argument. And also, I mean, related with these mechanisms and also the gatekeeping, how likely is that we see criminal violence against candidates? Or how often do criminal groups kill candidates in these favelas. I also think this is an important element in the discussion and in the results, right? So did you notice a lot of these criminal or these candidates getting killed or getting attacks or getting like some type of violence? Maybe they are kidnapping, I don't know. I think this is, I would like to see more discussion about the violence effect in this mechanism. And also, in the gatekeeping, then you see, well, in the gatekeeping, basically, they allow or they not allow candidates to go to certain regions, and your expectation, and basically you prove this, there is a higher vote concentration among fewer candidates. But what about the number of candidates that actually are running? Because you are looking at the votes, or are like the candidates who are getting votes, but how, I mean, just a count variable to, or maybe just a descriptive statistic to see how many candidates are registered to enter in these races, right? And maybe this is a prior decision that it's based on the criminal context in each of the favelas. And also, as I already mentioned, who are the candidates that are getting higher vote concentration? Do you find any interesting pattern in the profiles of these candidates, or who are winning? Because now you are showing or one of your independent variable is vote share, but what about winning likelihood? Who is more likely to win in each of these favelas? Maybe there is something interesting to explore about the winning likelihood of each of these candidates. And also, I was thinking about your discussion about criminal governance. It seems for me that you identify criminal governance if you have a criminal monopoly. But I would like to see more like a theoretical discussion or more elements of how you are thinking and the operationalization of this variable of criminal governance. So is criminal governance in your paper equal to have a criminal monopoly, or do you have to identify more variables or more elements to say, well, here we can identify a criminal governance structure? And I mean, because there is a broad discussion in the literature, and we understand several things when we talk about criminal governance, and I would like to see, how do you understand criminal governance in this context? And more related to the party and the electoral system in Brazil, my understanding is that party system in Brazil is very personalistic, and the natural of the electoral system and the open list campaigns tend to be more candidate-centered instead of party-centered. And how does this affect the agency? Is the agency in the side of parties, or is a decision of the personal candidates? And here I would like to know if, do you find any party patterns, or is just a single candidate decision to have this criminal clientelism? I think that will be really interesting to know. And also, do you find that specific parties tend to be more likely to win in criminal control regions, or how all the criminal the criminal clientelism is affecting the performance and the electoral outcomes for each party? So I think I will leave my comments here. I would like to say that I really enjoy reading this paper. I love your work, and I hope we can have more conversations in the future. So thank you, Jessie, and thank you, Sandra and Guillermo, for the opportunity to discuss this paper.
Thanks, Amalia. Jessie, would you like to respond to some of the comments, and then you already have some questions that I have lined up. And again, if anyone wants to join the Q&A, please send your name, and we can open the mic for you, or we can read your question. Go ahead, Jessie.
Yeah, Amalia, thank you so much. These are really great questions. So first, I'll just note that I think the who are they question about the politicians is super important. And this is something that I'm really working on. Probably won't fit in this paper, but as a different dissertation chapter, and probably a standalone paper as well. And some of the preliminary hypotheses that I'm exploring that also kind of lead into your second question about the political costs for candidates are that what I've noted so far in some preliminary analyses of who's winning in these races in Rio de Janeiro is that it's not necessarily candidates that are from the communities, but it's some that are not like the most notable or the most well-known candidates, but people in like the mid-level business class, not again, like not the most well-known, but kind of small business community outside of the favelas. And the hypotheses that I'm developing around this really tie into this idea about costs and risk that I think for candidates like this that might be from a middle-class neighborhood, I think that in some ways their background gives them some type of legal shield to campaign in these communities where perhaps the justice system or the courts or the legal courts, but also the electoral courts might not be investigating these people as thoroughly and might kind of turn the other direction and focus their attentions on other types of candidates. So I think that paradoxically, though, we kind of tend to think that, like drawing from the Sicilian mafia, let's say, that like the candidates that are the ones most closely tied to criminal organizations are the ones where they like grew up together and were best friends. I think what is going on in Rio de Janeiro is that it's candidates that have quite a different background than the criminal organizations, but they come in, they strike these deals with criminal organizations, and they leverage their privilege essentially in order to minimize political or legal risks going forward. So those ideas are still pretty new and underdeveloped, but it's something that I'm working on. And if you have thoughts about that, of course, I would love to hear them as well. For the question about corralling, you ask about controlling for violence. This is something I haven't done largely because the unit of analysis that I've obtained of basically the sub ballot box level is so disaggregated that even though violence is reported at the precinct level and I have access to that, the precinct includes many, many ballot boxes. So I haven't quite found a way to, unless I'm just coding all ballot boxes as whatever the precinct level is, but there still is a lot of variation from the many favelas to the many non-favela neighborhoods in one precinct. So again, open to suggestions on that, but that's kind of, that unit of analysis is just so much bigger than the really granular one that I have for voting data that's why I've omitted it so far. And then for your question about the number of candidates that are running, I think that this is something else related to the way that the electoral rules are in the Brazilian system. So it's a single district legislative race. So for the entire municipality of Rio, all candidates are running for every race. So, so the number of candidates is fixed, even if they essentially are just campaigning in the wealthy neighborhoods or essentially just campaigning in the favelas. So that's how I kind of just don't address it because we can assume that the candidate slate is going to be uniform for every single ballot box in the city across the thousands of favelas and then the many people that live not in favelas. And one quick clarification point, I think that this is something that I need to explore a bit more on your criminal governance as a criminal monopoly. But do you mean like monopoly over product, or are you talking specifically about the goods that they're selling? Yeah. What do you mean by?
Yeah, I was thinking like, I mean, if you find one criminal organization operating in a region, then you define. I mean, if we think as a dummy variable, you can say, okay, we have a criminal governance structure. So that was what I was thinking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, kind of exploring the relationship between, right now, I really only bring competition in as leverage for the diff and diff design, but integrating that into some of the more contested territories is something that I could improve on going forward with this. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jessie. So if it's okay, we could take a round of the questions that you accumulated in the chat, and then we'll open up to, I already have Camila for opening her mic, and if anyone wants to join, feel free to send your name. I guess one question by Guillermo Petriccioli here, a former student at CIDE. It's like at this point about from Amalia on how in Mexico we're thinking about criminal governance from a more violent perspective, as you very precisely refer in your manuscript, right, on how to think about criminal governance from this other perspective. So I think it's interesting to see always this contrasting experiences from those that study Brazil, those that study Mexico, and we see criminal governance, as Amalia says, from a more violent or less violent perspective. Then Nicolas Ortuño, also a student from CIDE, says exactly what happens after they strike these deals. Do drug criminal leaders expect something in exchange later on, or how do the dynamics change within their communities? And Oscar Alvarado asks precisely about how can you detect which candidates are able to receive criminal support? And I think this goes to the last question from Amalia on your measure on this exchange and criminal governance. And then I'll open up to the mic for other people.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the question about candidate violence, because I forgot to address it after Amalia said it.
Sorry, Jessie, just one more question, just for you to consider. Sorry to Jen Piscopo about how gender affects which candidates strike bargains. I think that's that's also a great question, how gender is playing out within this selection of candidates striking these deals.
Yeah, absolutely. So for candidate violence, actually, it's very, very rare, or at least assassinations are very, very rare in the municipality of Rio de Janeiro. There's some really exciting work developed by Mari Carvalho she's also a PhD student at UCSD, on assassinations at the local level. And they really have been increasing over the last several years in Brazil, but most of these are outside of the capital, in small to medium-sized municipalities across the country. But actually assassinations, I think because Rio de Janeiro as a municipality and a state has a lot of resources, there's media attention. I think it's just, in some ways, it really brings so much heat to the criminal organizations to commit such a politically costly act as assassinating that you might say, for how violent the city is, it's actually a bit surprising that we don't observe it that much. But I can't even think of the last time I heard of an assassination happening within the municipality in Rio, not since I've been studying it. For the question about kind of what happens next and what the citizens in these communities should expect, this is also something that I'm hoping to incorporate in the book project. And the term, I guess, that I'm toying with now is kind of this idea of a tragic peace, where so long as the criminal organizations keep violence levels to a tolerable amount, then that relationship with the politician carries on relatively smoothly and peacefully. But what this means for the voters is that the voters kind of forego any other types of benefits or any types of social policy in exchange for peace. So the voters get peace by supporting the candidate that the criminal organization wants, but in exchange, their politician might not be accountable to them really at all, because the criminal organization kind of interrupts that the relationship of electoral accountability or the electoral connection between candidate and voter. So stay tuned for more on that. And then the question about gender. So some of my priors would be that this would be almost exclusively a male candidate dominated phenomenon, because it's mostly men in these criminal organizations. But several of the highest profile of these cases where people have gotten caught have all been women candidates. So I think that it's honestly, I think there's a lot fewer people that have gotten caught, and I think it from my interviews, I believe that this is actually quite widespread amongst people in these low-level city council level electoral races. And I think that this is something that female candidates do. What the proportion of of women to men is I'm not really sure, but at least among the people that have been caught, I was surprised that it was such a high share of women participating among the very few people that have been caught and that have gone to court for these types of collusion style agreements with criminal organizations.
Thanks, Jessie. So now I'll open up the mic. Camila wanted to participate, and if anyone wants to raise their hand, please go ahead. Camila, thanks.
Thanks, Sandra. Thank you so much, Jessie, for sharing your work with us. It's really fascinating, and it's great to meet you. I have 3 questions related to the internal validity of your work, another one on the external validity, and a last one on the scope conditions of your argument. So on the internal validity, I was wondering if you perhaps could talk a little bit more about the assumption that there might not be criminal governance spillover across your units of analysis. You were focusing on favelas, but I wonder if like this, the limits of the favelas actually coincide with criminal groups governance. It seems to me that there might be some spillover because of how the results somewhat changed from the first to the second identification strategy. So on the diff and diff, you find even stronger evidence in favor of H2 and H3, which leads me to think that the less strong evidence, so to speak, for the first identification strategy might be due to spillover effects. So I don't know if that's something that you perhaps have considered or if something that might be happening there. The second point is on the external validity of the argument. So you seem to be focusing on criminal actors that do not have political agendas, and they seem to be in this machine gun politics game because of the economic benefits that they receive from this exchange with politicians. But there are other contexts in which these criminal actors do have political agendas, like in Colombia, and we see similar patterns. So I was wondering if you have given some thought to these, additional condition, or whether you would expect to see something different going on when criminal actors have political agendas and interact with politicians. And then the third one, echoing the previous comments on the political costs that these actors are facing. So I was wondering, why aren't all politicians bidding for these bailiwicks or groups of, electorates within the favelas? What are the costs again, but not necessarily the political costs only that they're facing? Perhaps there might be one additional actor or institution missing. Perhaps the judicial system has something to do with it. So I was wondering if you have considered that as part of the scope condition for your argument, sort of like what additional element that we should consider, take into account when identifying the additional context we can expect to see similar dynamics happening. So yeah, that's what I wanted to share. Thank you so much.
But if there are other participations, if not, I can sort of, Daniel, go ahead.
Hello, Daniel Rio from Fundação Getúlio Vargas, joining you from São Paulo this time. Thank you for putting this together. A really fascinating talk, Jessie. Love to learn about it. I'm originally from Rio, born in Rio, so it's fascinating to hear you explain something we've been hearing about all of our lives and explaining so cogently. I have a few comments and questions, and one is actually you explain your identification strategy for the voting, the ballot box, and I found that was really interesting and clever way of doing it. But I keep wondering whether what you are measuring there when you do your approach to figure out where people live are you considering where the people actually live or where they're registered to vote? Because this is one of the issues, and you explained part of it in your talk. Often people here, they're not registered to vote near the place where they actually live. And that's because once you get your first registration to vote, it's really, really tough to change it. It's a lot of work to do it. So sometimes people prefer every 4 years just going across the city to vote, unless they change cities or they do this massive change, whether you're then pressed to go there to the electoral services and change your actual registered place of voting and residential area. So I'm wondering whether this creates any issues for you. The other question I really wanted to push you on, I think this already showed up a little bit in today's discussion, but you are obviously explaining a lot how criminal enterprises go on and deliver for politicians. So they're serving the politicians in they're serving the politicians. And in this sense, is there any motivation other than the obvious financial motivation that you could identify to the criminal groups to do this? Are they selecting the politicians that they are supporting? Are they thoughtfully engaging on this process as saying, electing this guy serves my purposes as a criminal enterprise or organization? And then the last one is about reputational risks. And it seems to me that it's very easy for the politicians that eventually get caught, or when there's suspicion they're doing this, to plausibly or sufficiently plausibly deny that they're doing this on purpose, unless they are directly seen giving money to some person that is widely known. They usually will say, oh no, I thought I was just meeting with this guy that is a sort of community leader or something like this, and they often get away with this. So these were my 3 general ideas, and thank you for the presentation.
So if
I'll go ahead and take these 2 sets of questions.
Okay, good.
Okay, great. So Camila, thank you for these questions. So for the first point about spillover from favelas to the asphalt, this is in some ways, Rio de Janeiro is actually quite a stark case where we can really see almost like the binary of criminally governed versus not. And this is due to the specific geographic features of the city, where these favelas, at least not in the west zone of the city, but in the rest of it, are really these like jagged hillsides, and the state capacity it very visibly changes at the perimeter of the favela. So I think, you mentioned that this might explain how the effects from the first model are more attenuated compared to those from the diff and diff. But I actually think that this is because I haven't figured out how to deal with this yet, but because the favelas included in the first regression are 800 and some that have varying levels of criminal control. And really, I throw them all in there because they have some level of criminal presence, but the ones in the second set, if they're strong enough to have a turf war, like these 12 favelas that I included in the diff and diff, have robust criminal presence and governance. And I think that there's quite a few more in the first set that have criminal control, but various levels of like what governance really means. So that's kind of how I have explained why those results are a little bit weaker in the first one. However, I do think it's important, and I think it's convincing to show that this is a phenomenon that's broad across the entire city, and that it's not just something in one or 2 favelas that are really noteworthy. But I haven't figured out how to make that measure of criminal governance more detailed yet. And I think that actually is quite a difficult task. For the second one about criminal actors not having political agendas in other contexts. So I think that One of the things that, that I really hope can be learned from this project in other contexts is that criminal organizations, even if they do have some ulterior motives or some deeper connections to politicians, use corralling and gatekeeping. It's not always going to be the case where it's this criminals for sale type of dynamic or type of marketplace, but I have already started collecting cases around the world of the presence of corralling and gatekeeping, and these as the major tactics that criminal organizations use in order to help get their candidate elected. So I think that being a little bit flexible and broad about what the relationship looks like, but using those to characterize those dynamics is what can be most useful for helping it travel to other cases. And then the last point about why aren't all politicians bidding. This is again something that I didn't present today, but that's in the broader dissertation project that I'm thinking about kind of as like the marketplace for votes, whether it's a vote buyer's market or a vote seller's market, where politicians or criminal groups, in either case, one will have the upper hand. And I think Rio de Janeiro is one of those cases where it's a vote buyer's market, meaning that the politicians have more leverage than the criminal organization. And I'm defining that as such that the politicians can walk away from an interaction with the criminal group and still plausibly get elected from you know, like bread and butter campaigning in the middle class neighborhoods or working with church leaders or something. And in some other contexts, I've already referenced Sicily, so let's stick with that as an example. Like if the Sicilian mafia was so strong and they controlled everything and one was trying to get elected there, then the only way to get elected is through the mafia, then you have to make the deal or else you're not getting elected. And Rio de Janeiro is not a case like that. So I still have more details to flesh out on the marketplace for votes, but this is absolutely on that track. So I'm happy to hear you mention it. And then Danielle, thank you for these questions too. So for the first more technical one, the specific way that I calculate this variable is about, is the proportion of people that are registered to vote in a certain zip code. So I might have groups, let's say there's like 100 zip codes that are in a certain favela. Then for every ballot box, I will get a share of the people that live in those zip codes that vote at that ballot box. So this, you know, technically to your point, this is the people that are registered from an address, not that actually live there. But in going through the voting records, all of the people that justify are just not included in this analysis. So it's a gap, but it's also, I think it still is a plausible assumption that people aren't going to be traveling so far. I think since justification, and justifying, just in case for people that don't know the Brazilian term, justifying is basically where, since voting is mandatory, you go to a nearby polling station and say you show up just so that you don't get disenfranchised or have to pay a fine, basically. So I'm not including this rather large sum of people that are justifying, but still turnout is still, you know, in like the 70s and 80%. So I think it still is a decent measure and still could be improved, but certainly I think it's a pretty big advance from any way that people have tried to measure voting outcomes with favelas in the past, which was just like drawing a 200-meter buffer around the favela and coding every single polling station as one and everyone further from a favela is 0. And even looking just in those close subset, we see there's a lot more texture in people that live in favelas versus not. How criminal enterprises deliver to politicians and if there's a motivation by the criminal group, if the criminal group is expecting something in return. I think that, you know, as the militias grow stronger and stronger, we have reasons to believe that the militias do operate in a bit more sophisticated and like politically calculating way than some of the drug traffickers. Because there's just so much within case variation, I've kind of tried to leave this construct really, really broad to be more encompassing and hopefully help it travel to cases that where there is kind of like a longer term quid pro quo versus these one-shot transactions. And then the reputational risks for the politicians. This is, I mentioned earlier, some of the theorizing that I'm developing for the book project about candidates not from these communities. I think these are specific, precisely the type of candidates that have fewer risks and are able to kind of convincingly, let's say that if they were brought in for questioning for one of the courts, I wouldn't be surprised if they could kind of talk their way around it by saying, you know, this is the way that everyone does it. And I you know, like my back was against the wall and I was doing this to like eliminate violence towards my team. Kind of think that this is that I wouldn't be surprised if that would be a successful strategy for these politicians, even if they willingly were participating in the transaction.
Thanks, Jessie. So we have a question by Christina, our colleague from the International Studies Department. In case you want to use your mic, Christina, or should I read it? I think I'll go ahead and read it about differences in the types of criminal groups that might lead to additional insights. Are there specific types of criminal groups that are more likely to engage in vote selling? Are some types of groups more likely to engage in corralling versus gatekeeping? Does the size of criminal group affect the participation in the vote market? And have you thought about the external validity of this dynamic in settings where groups are directly engaged in the political process, such as post-conflict settings where the line of criminal and rebel groups may blur? And if I may, then I'll add I'll squeeze my comments before we wrap up, but I think we'll still have time for another question. First of all, just to say, like, your criticisms and observations and constructive feedback to the Cathar board with Guillermo is very well taken. I agree that we do not delve into the role of politicians, and in our defense, I think we simply are unable to say something on that point, and that knowing the great diversity of cases, we try to sort of contain ourselves from saying anything about politicians' intentions, right? But I really applaud the way that you're approaching and as I said, the extensive work that you've been doing this, and your observations nonetheless made me think about whether we should be thinking about a broader definitions of criminal governance, you know, like from the less violent experiences in Brazil to the more violent in Mexico. Perhaps think about the established and ordered criminal governance regimes to the contested and violent criminal attempts to establish criminal governance regimes. So I think that there's a lot that's still to learn there, and what is it exactly that we're looking at in different points in time. Regarding corralling and gatekeeping, I really like your typology of the different strategies by OCGs. I kept wondering about whether corralling and gatekeeping, or I kept thinking about how they intertwine in more deeper ways, right? On the one hand, they're reinforcing each other, as you argue and show. However, gatekeeping at the same time could be limiting participation because voters could be disencouraged by those limited options that some survey data has shown. I think there's the key point here is about that institutional context within Brazil. But I understand that this is not an issue in a criminally governed territory where there are no options, right? So I think that that's a key point here. However, in your qualitative section, you seem to suggest that voters do have agency. Since you point to their complaints to the electoral authority. So this made me think about to what extent do they have agency, how do they use that agency? And well, it's great to have Eduardo Moncada here, but I think that sort of resistance, right, from citizens, that's what I kept thinking about. How is this sort of compensated through other mechanisms of resistance by voters? So let me go back to your observation for those of us who have focused on violent actions by organized crime. I kept wondering that your preposition on gatekeeping at times seems largely non-violent, though not so much at the end of the qualitative section. So can you say something about that violent gatekeeping? Can it have distinct effects on turnout? I thought that maybe you might be interested in looking into the sum of the literature that draws from the Mexican case to examine how violence has shaped turnout. I think that you can both argue against those findings in these studies, as well as find them helpful for understanding the distinct results for turnout. Another related questions, I thought about what are these politicians' positions regarding security policies and their stances on the issue in their campaigns. One would imagine these strategies of gatekeeping shaping the supply of policies. So I thought about the broader consequences of these strategies, as others have already mentioned. Regarding the data, lately we have had a discussion of how much we can actually do and learn with newspaper data collection processes in the context of in which journalists themselves are being threatened by organized crime. And you know, you've been very kind to comment our work with Cassie Durf. And you use a crime blog. I think it's great the way that you're using it. I kept wondering about what you have learned in this process. I bet our students will really learn from that experience. And we have a blog del narco, and we're never sure whether we should be using it or not. And then finally, I know that you're interested in Mexico. The case of the election of 2011 in Michoacan, I think you will find it really, really interesting for you, because there's where I think that's a case where we see both gatekeeping and corralling. Some municipal races in Durango, for example, have only had one candidate, and I think that's those for you to identify those municipalities will be speaking to what you're documenting for the Brazilian case. Our colleague Aldo Ponce isn't here, but he's also in the political studies department, and has documented the decline of the number of candidates, as you have shown here. But I think that going deeper into those mechanisms that you showed, Jessie, that's a major contribution. So congratulations again.
Oh, wow, thank you so much. I'm so glad we're recording this so I can have this to refer to in making some edits going forward. So first, okay, I'll respond to Christina's point about different types of criminal organizations. So I think that the types of criminal organizations that practice extortion and protection rackets, again, this is something that maybe Eduardo has some thoughts on as well, but those that have these practices of going door to door and collecting things or demanding things from voters that, if we kind of extrapolate away, don't actually look that different from campaigning, that these types of protection racket style criminal organizations whose foot soldiers and employees kind of practice these in their daily criminal tasks are going to have a more natural aptitude, or going to have like a more comparative advantage towards both gatekeeping and corralling than like the more retail focused criminal organizations. So one of the strengths, but also weaknesses in this, in studying this in the Rio de Janeiro case, is that these are the militias that are predominantly extortion racket style criminal organizations. And in some subgroup analyses looking at heterogeneous effects in the paper, I do find that the effects are stronger in just militia dominated communities than in drug trafficker dominated communities, although they're robust in both. But it's really hard to say if this is because of their abilities as extortion rackets and kind of the comparative advantage that being a protection racket gives you, or because of the aforementioned possible political motives that just might make them be trying harder. So I'm not totally sure, but I have some other hypotheses I'm developing that I think that the types of criminal organizations that will be more suited towards these practices are those that predominantly traffic in protection and extortion. And Sandra, on this point about voters having agency, I think this is a fabulous question that I need to think more about. I think like my gut reaction is, I don't think that the voters have no agency. And in some ways it's a little bit of a weakness in the paper where they are written as quite passive. I don't want to focus so much on saying that politicians are not passive and then make voters entirely passive actors in the paper. But I think that there is some threshold to think of even if voters are being strategic and they're just choosing to obey, or they're choosing to comply, then I think that is what is happening in some of these cases, just because the threat of violence is so scary and outweighs or outweighs potential coordination. And I think that okay, on this next point too, about both gatekeeping and corralling, I think what we observe often is that the violence is unrealized, although the threats are graphic and are violent. So I think that there's kind of a gap between how intense the threats are and how scary it is for the voters that might cow them into submission, or might make some of these voters afraid or only comfortable sending anonymous complaints to this website that I was able to access. But there's no real large scale electoral violence happening. I think it predominantly rests in the threat of terror or the threat of violence. I'll definitely look up this case of Michoacan in 2011. Thank you for suggesting that.
Well, thank you so much, Jessie. That's you got a great turnout, and you got a great set of participations, and as you can see, really everybody is really excited and really intrigued because of, I think, that contrasting experience between Mexico and Brazil is always something that catches our attention, and there's so much more that we should be thinking about. Thanks again, Eduardo, for joining despite all the difficulties. Thanks to everyone for being here and supporting PEV for your solidarity, for us to keep growing and connecting within Mexico, outside of Mexico. We hope that you can join our future seminars. We want to thank again everyone for being here today, for spending your Friday with us. And we look forward to seeing you again. And congratulations, Jessie, all the best in your next adventures and postdoc at Syracuse. Whatever you decide, we're sure there's a lot more success and coming in your way.
Thank you all, everybody, so much for these wonderful comments and for your attention. It was such a pleasure joining you.
Thanks, Jen. Take care. Bye.